What this week's NFL news means for fantasy drafts as we enter a crucial stage of the fantasy season. Huge amount of drafts going on this week. Lots of people, obviously, home leagues, there's the high stakes leagues, there's best ball drafts that are starting to get into that point where they are filling. And we obviously want to know exactly what moves we should make in those drafts. We are going to talk about all that and more today and possibly get into some listener questions here on RotoViz Overtime. I'm joined, as always, by Shawn Siegele. My name is Colm Kelly. Shawn, I'm going to give you the floor here. Stand up to the podium at the start of this show and hit the listeners with a pretty busy week in the Shawn Siegele writing schedule as we get the zero RB candidates, all 15 up there. We get wide receiver targets. I know you told me just before we started recording that the priority list is about to get a fresh coat of paint up on the RotoViz homepage. Let the listeners know what they should be checking out up on rotoviz.com.
Yeah, Colin, this is it, right? This is our fantasy Super Bowl from a drafting perspective. And so the zero RB top 15 candidates countdown, all of those are up on the site at this point, including the final five, the league winners. We had the home league draft plan come out at the end of last week in time for folks to draft on Saturday and Sunday nights. Blair and Kevin are working on some individual formats, but I was kind of looking through and breaking down some of the trends across all of the different home league providers. And so you can jump into that, see what the best ways are to play and dominate your home leagues. Home leagues, you should definitely be able to win at a pretty high clip with the content that we have. Certainly, you're not going to win every time you get into the semis, the finals. Those games, can go sideways on you, get unlucky. But moving to that point should certainly be part of your plan every single season. And then, Colin, we had been joking about it on Ceiling Bananas for a while. I've been kind of hinting at it on the site if I could make it work. This season has been so much fun with more late opportunities at wide receiver. And at the same time, you can do things like draft a lot of early running backs. Anyone who hasn't checked out the rookie heavy version of Stealing Bananas will want to do that, where Ben and I just really lucked into being able to draft Ashton Genty, Travion Henderson, and RJ Harvey all onto the same team at well below ADP. You have those moments of magic, those moments of serendipity. You've got to embrace them, if not grab hold with both hands, which then does mean the potential you're going to want some of those receivers late. So the top 10 zero wide receiver options are also up there on the site. And as you mentioned, I kind of do the priority targets in a variety of different ways. I've presented the tiered rankings with targets at different junctures throughout the offseason. Certainly, if you've been following along with that, you've been able to get some of our favorite guys at fantastic prices before they really rose heading into sort of the final weekend here. The other version of it that I do that I have done once previously this season, but that will be up where you look at the priority targets, the guys you might draft in emergency, the guys you might draft in tactical situations, the guys you might draft when they fall. And then, of course, Colm, we have the players who don't have a designation. It's always possible that one of them could fall so far that you also would want to throw them into a build. But that's that piece. Also, there will be tactics discussed at the end of it. How do you make that work in home leagues? How do you make that work in high stakes? Basically, how do you win the 2025 fantasy football environment? Colm, it all comes down to this. We are here. Football is upon us.
Final stop. Get ready to go. So we are all set for this week's drafts, and I know there'll be a lot more action to come before week one finally kicks off, but it is almost here. Shawn, you mentioned the zero wide receiver piece, and I'm not going to spoil this name, but somebody that we had a lot of fun through the course of our rookie drafts, picking, that I kind of every time was like, who do we draft? And I'm like, what about this guy? And we drafted him quite a few times together, and I've drafted him a lot. So I'm glad to see him make the list. I'll give a spoiler. He's number 7. I'm not going to say the name of who it is, but a name that does appear at number 3 is Jalen Coker. And that's going to be a move that is also opened up as well with a nice pathway with Adam Thielen being traded now back to the Minnesota Vikings. Pretty cool for him to get back to where it all kind of kicked off. We'll talk maybe if it impacts the Vikings at all, but in terms of how it impacts Jalen Coker and his pathway here as a a zero wide receiver star for this season. Obviously, we're big on Tet McMillan. I think this really shows that the team are all set with him as the alpha in the team. But Jalen Coker, somebody who I don't think you could say went under the radar this offseason, but we talked about him a number of times. But in terms of like somebody who was going at the later part of the draft where you're like, well, Adam Thielen's there. How does he get into a clear, role? That has been, blown wide open now. Jalen Coker, what is your expectations now post trade for Adam Thielen? And how does that set Jalen Coker up to have a wonderful season here?
So, Coker, for anybody who doesn't know or is skeptical because of the draft situation, he was actually much more of a producer than these guys who are the big hype guys this year, right? Almost any individual game for like Jalen Coker in college, especially when you consider the context of his offense, would be like a full career for Deontay Thornton, a full career for Isaac Tesla. And then he goes to the combine at a pretty good size. Right? This is not a small receiver. Jumps 42.5 inches, the leading number of any receiver in the last 3 years, only tied with our other favorite Malik Washington at that lofty. So you've got the athleticism. He comes out, he plays well as a rookie, and now they're creating some space for him. So one of the things that we're looking at here with Coker is that he can probably line up at a variety of spots. To have some alignment data in the wide receiver article. People will want to check that out. But when you think about the Panthers and their desire to probably not write off Xavier Worthy quite yet, and in some ways, I think this is more about making space for him because otherwise he would be buried and they would have to go into year 2 saying, okay, another receiver bust for us after Jonathan Mingo. This way they can try to unlock him. They can try to bring him kind of at his own pace while Coker plays inside. You have McMillan and Leggett mostly on the outside. Again, these guys are going to shift around somewhat in terms of how they are used. But you have those three guys. You have Jatavian Sanders there as a potential breakout tight end. His second year, one of the things I think that people miss a little bit on him is how big of a recruit Sanders was, how good he was, especially at the tight end position, sort of where he was relative to Adonai Mitchell, who obviously is a trendy breakout guy because of his size and athleticism and a few of the numbers that he has put up at different junctures. You have those four pieces, and then you have Bryce Young trying to consolidate what looked like an emergence over the second half of last year. Colm, I think it's pretty exciting. I don't know that we should expect big numbers. So much of this is going to be a Bryce Young and McMillan offense. And then is Young high volume enough? Are the Panthers shootout mode enough? Are we going to see enough games like the one at the end of the season with the Atlanta Falcons that we get true points, we get true scoring? Or is it merely going to be that the Panthers have made a very nice move here to develop their young core and eventually be a strong offense and a strong contending team maybe in 2026?
I think that there is the possibility of that. It is pretty cool though to see a team with a young group kind of take the step forward and plan that to be the direction that they move forward in here. Hopefully Bryce Young can continue his development. You mentioned Sanders, who we've talked like numerous times about. I actually got a couple of after our recent drafts, we missed out on Sanders a couple of times, Shawn, but the listeners who drafted Sanders, they have stepped forward, and every time it has been an OT listener who has been able to get him, which is always fun. But yeah, McMillan now, the pathway is wide open for him to be the standout star on this team. And when you look at the way that targets and things were shared around in this offense last year, a lot of those opened up, but obviously we didn't have McMillan there. But if you were setting a kind of over under at your expectations post this move for targets for Tet McMillan, how many over 120 are we going to set that bar at?
Over, Colm, over, right? Let's go like 137. That's what Jackson Smith and Jigba put up last year in year 2. I mean, you would really like to get up there to Wan'Dale Robinson at 141. Wan'Dale Robinson, 141 targets, only 699 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns. It was one of the silliest seasons in NFL history. I love Wandale. I'm going to blame that on the Giants. Jerry Jeudy, 144 targets in 17 games. We know that that was inflated in some ways by the fact that the Browns ran a huge number of passing plays. They crushed the rest of the NFL in total dropbacks, and yet also limited by the QBs at his disposal. Colin, we get a lot of pushback on Jerry Jeudy, who last season drew 144 targets, which was eighth in the entire NFL, went for 1,229 yards, only had the 4 TDs, again, in part because of the QB play. It's always interesting here, and this kind of leads into some of the other questions that we get about the role of efficiency and yards per out, all those types of things. Now, first of all, Jerry Jeudy, once we got into the Jameis Winston time period, had no problem from a yards per route perspective. So that's something I think people are missing when they think, oh, well, the total number of dropbacks is going to fall way back. This kind of dovetails with another one of the questions that we often get. But before we get there, while we're kind of in this mix, I do want to say that I was skeptical of Ricky Pearsall and the price recently, certainly as it relates to Jerry Jeudy. I would still take Jerry Jeudy first in a vacuum. But Pearsall has really consolidated the situation there in San Francisco. Juwan Jennings, unfortunately, has not put himself in good position. And so I just wanted to make that note that I think anyone who's wanting to draft in this last week and feels like they just would prefer to take the chance on Pearsall. Now, again, with Pearsall, you do have the questions about profile, and that extended even to last year. He's one of these guys who really did struggle outside of the one big game, and yet people are willing to give him sort of a free pass on that. At this point, I kind of think that free pass is justified. So I think you balance the different things that are going on there. Pearsall is in a group right now that is pretty interesting. We talk about some of the flat parts in the draft, but right before Pearsall, you have Calvin Ridley, Emeka Egbuka, Devontae Smith. Those guys are pretty clearly ahead of him when you talk about risk, reward, safety, all of those types of things. Doesn't mean he couldn't beat them, but those guys are pretty clearly ahead. Right behind him, Jalen Waddle. Waddle may have more problems than Pearsall has. Zay Flowers is a guy where people are concerned justifiably about ceiling. Travis Hunter, with the recent missed practice time, people get more skeptical when they know it's going to be such a challenge to play both sides. Rashee Rice isn't going to play in 6 games, so you need to think, and you basically need to think that Rashee Rice should go in that Malik Neighbors area to pick him at that price. And then we have Jeudy and Rome Odunze right behind him. Colm, I love all of these tricky draft decisions in maybe the most important part of the draft, the most important draft range for 2025.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right, in that area. And there's a lot of ways that people can do it in drafts, but yeah, a certain amount of names there. If people are deciphering Shawn's targets, there's a couple of ones in there. They don't need to decipher Jerry Jeudy, but the rest of them you can work between the tea leaves. Shawn, looking at the other side of that, Thielen ends up with the Vikings. Just this can be quick, doesn't have to be expanded, but we do have Jordan Addison suspended for the first 3 games of the season. I think Adam Thielen is probably more of a reflection on Ty Felton and how they probably don't think that he's ready to step into a role, the equivalent of trying to give him some of those targets that Addison would be getting early in the season. There isn't really anything else at wide receiver. Jill Naylor's there, for example. Rondale Moore's on injured reserve, but they have obviously TJ Hockenson then at tight end. Any impact at all on your thoughts on Addison, Jefferson, or Hockenson, or just business as usual with those guys for where you have them ranked?
It's mostly business as usual, but it is something where you had this possibility before Thielen gets over there that with Addison out, Jefferson and Hockenson were the 2 best picks for the first 3 weeks of the season. That over those 3 weeks, they scored so many points that everyone in retrospect is like, well, we knew Jerry Jeudy was the best wide receiver in the NFL and he didn't have any target competition. So why wasn't he the 101? We know that TJ Hockenson scored like Travis Kelce before that injury, and now he's had more time to recover. Why wasn't he up there with Trey McBride? Those are the kinds of conversations that almost certainly were going to happen if you didn't have this other piece where now JJ McCarthy has some other options. But I do think that it does now give us a little bit more safety and more floor for McCarthy, which is probably important for those other guys, right? The other part of it is that maybe it's like 80% those guys go on a rampage because of all the targets, but 20% they just are 3 and out, 3 and out, 3 and out because you don't have enough variety. You don't have enough different pieces who can challenge a defense. You don't have that safety valve for a guy who will be starting his first NFL games. That part could be crucial. So it lowers the ceiling a little bit, but it also, I think, avoids sort of an apocalyptic outcome. And that for all of those players is good. I think it probably also doesn't hurt Addison that much, but it does introduce a bit of a wild card. And this is the thing for all of these guys who aren't playing. For Rice, for Addison, even a little bit potentially for Jaden Reed if he misses a game or two, and you
Yeah.
have Matthew Golden take off. Certainly in the situation with Brandon Ayuk, where one of the things I've gotten a little bit less comfortable with, I guess, is the way that Kyle Shanahan has posed the return of Ayuk, where he's saying week 6, but sometimes that becomes week 11. If you're pretty confident it's going to be week 6, then you don't throw that in of, well, maybe it's going to be week 11 just to let people know that, I mean, it's week 11, right? And by the time you get to week 11, then if Ricky Pearsall is what people want him to be, then Brandon Ayuk is done as the star. Doesn't mean he won't score points, but he's done as the star. And so I think it does matter, and it does make Addison less palatable, certainly less exciting. And yet, because of price, it probably doesn't push you off of him, especially as he continues to move down as a result. And just to finish that up, to your point that it's mostly a reflection on Felton. Felton was kind of in this group of guys like a Jalen Lane, like a Keandre Lambert Smith, where there was reason to believe that he could be a breakout, not really star, but someone who was fun, someone who created some big plays, someone you could rely on in your offense to soak up a few targets. He's not gone the same direction as some of those other young hype players. You mentioned the issues with Naylor, and then, I mean, beyond that, they just don't have anything. You do need to have some pieces there for the young QB. I think you nailed it in terms of what the Vikings are thinking when they make this move.
Yeah, and you mentioned Felton as well. Like he had a chance here to impress in preseason, and then to the opposite of these missing players angles to impress, and then to be part of the offense. But Trenton in the opposite direction. The other big move was the Rashee Rice part. Shawn may not expand here on where he should be going in these draft scenarios post the 6-game suspension. That happened very quickly, obviously, over the course of kind of a 24-hour period this week, where it looked like it was going to be the NFL again looking for the longer suspension. And I think that the Rice camp came to the conclusion that like it's going to be worse for us if we stretch this out. So you are in a situation now where Xavier Worthy is like slotted in as the wide receiver 1 on this. It really opens a path. I know Jalen Royals has been one of your kind of late priority targets over the course of the draft season, and he gets potentially that early season opportunity that we're kind of saying that Felton's going to miss out on. A couple of questions come in from listeners again, around Xavier Worthy and how we are so enthusiastic about him prior to the Rice news. Now we have the Rice confirmation. Talks about the inefficient rookie kind of numbers depending on what way you spin things, and classing him up as like at best being a Jameson Williams style player. And I think, on my opinion, that's doing a disservice to both Jameson Williams and Xavier Worthy, saying that like, oh, he's only like, I think Jameson Williams is really set to take another big step forward here in the Lions offense this year. I think people will be looking at what his role has been versus what his role is going to be very differently as the season progresses here. But Xavier Worthy, Shawn, we thought it would be like 4 to 6 games. It's guaranteed now to be the 6 games. If we look at how the season finished for him last year and how he's set up now to lead this offense, and you're looking at those situations where he has a clear runway now to become the guy in this offense. Are you moving him up? It's almost impossible, Shawn, to move him up higher than you would have him in your rankings, but give us your thoughts here on the fallout from the Rice suspension.
Yeah, I think most of the people who don't understand the Worthy thing would understand it if they read the article. Now, it's fine that they don't. I mean, there are plenty of articles that are very good that I haven't read. So I'm not saying that you have that responsibility, and certainly not everybody has a subscription. But when we think about Worthy, people tend to forget the playoffs, which were a big deal. People tend to forget the rushing element, which is a big deal. People tend to discount the manufactured touches, despite everyone's favorite Rashee Rice is purely manufactured touches, right? Manufactured touches matter, especially in an offense that
If you can
throws
get
short a
manufactured
lot.
touches, Shawn, it is one of the best things that you can get. The team has given you a specific way to get touches and to try and use your strengths.
And people mention the efficiency. Blair has done another big piece talking about fantasy points over expected and how it's such an easy way to win. You take the guys who have been efficient. And so we're certainly not suggesting that you want to go draft a bunch of inefficient players, but there's a difficulty that people have of putting those types of things in context, right? One of the third most inefficient player last season was Adonai Mitchell, who is trendy because of a targets per route element, I guess, despite the fact that Mitchell's profile as a collegian is someone who doesn't draw targets. He's a splash play guy. He's athletic. He's going to score touchdowns if he gets out there a decent amount. I mean, there's a path to success for Mitchell, but it's probably not the path that people are counting on. It's a misunderstanding of who a player is. You look at some other guys that we like, Troy Franklin, he was minus 18. He was somebody, and this gets to sort of the Denver Broncos question, where you have to look at that and you have to very strongly feel like Troy Franklin is a different guy than what he was last year because we have other information that trumps it and because we have subsequent developments, right? So again, there's a very different situation between veterans who are fading guys who have never been good and players who were elite college prospects, especially when those guys are young. Xavier Worthy and Troy Franklin, 21-year-old rookies. That makes a big difference. Xavier Legette was minus 17, and you put him in this group where he was actually not a good prospect, and so it's pretty debilitating. It doesn't mean he couldn't break out, but he's someone who that is a big black mark for. You go through Malik Neighbors minus 12. Again, we have information about Malik Neighbors. We understand the context for him where he's drawing an insane number of targets. He's playing for the New York Giants. He's playing with these terrible quarterbacks. He's playing hurt. And so we know again how to place that into the overall context. Marquise Brown, right? Probably the most shocking thing that I ever see on the internet are some of these Chiefs fan sites that are anticipating Hollywood Brown having a bigger role than Xavier Worthy, which I mean, Hollywood's not even going to be available most of the time, right? And has been done for a while. His efficiency last season in those games to finish was awful. There's just no comparison between the two. And there's no comparison between a guy who is re-signed as a free agent because nobody else wants him versus someone who is a 21-year-old first round pick who was good as a rookie, right? George Pickens, someone that, again, we have other information about, but put up negative FPOE last season. Garrett Wilson, minus 6. We keep moving through all these pieces. We haven't gotten to Xavier Worthy, who was supposedly so inefficient. You finally get into the positive, and we see him barely over and in the 3-4 range. That's not great. I would love for him to have been much better as a rookie. But again, then you think about those hits in the playoffs, changing things up there. The other thing that Blair has written about extensively is this element of yards per route run versus other metrics. How do the metrics that you're using predict ADP versus predicting fantasy points? People who are really locked into yards per route run. And especially when you're talking about some of these young guys where you're saying, oh, well, they're inefficient as a rookie, they're not going to be a star. Yards per route run is much better at predicting ADP than it is fantasy points. A lot of the things that people are missing and then discounting about Xavier Worthy are better at predicting fantasy points. Colm, we continue to get questions about Xavier Worthy. When Xavier Worthy, you go back and you compare the rookie seasons of Rashee Rice and Xavier Worthy, and you take the best possible break point for Rashee Rice, not for Xavier Worthy, where it'll be a bigger margin, but for Rashee Rice, and you take that point, week 12 to the end of the playoffs, Xavier Worthy scored more points. That doesn't mean he's going to score more points per game than Rashee Rice. This year, we have the secondary breakout that it's just a tiny sample, but appears to be confirmed by what Rice did to start last season. We don't want to discount that either. People who are drafting Rashee Rice, I think, have plenty of information at their disposal to make that pick confidently. I'm not saying that's a bad pick, but when you're looking at these two guys and the different ways that they're treated, especially when Worthy can do so many things that Rashee Rice has never demonstrated that he was able to do, and Xavier Worthy has demonstrated that at each step of the way, far younger than Rashee Rice, it's a bit odd that people look at it that way. Take someone else. That same time span there, Xavier Worthy scored a point more per game than Nico Collins, who, I mean, Colm, he's going in the first round because people are absolutely in love with some of the peripherals. I'm certainly not saying that Xavier Worthy is going to score more points than Nico Collins. I'm just trying to create some context here and some anchors for people as they think about these guys. And when you think about someone like a Xavier Worthy, even taking out the playoffs, right, where he was on fire, you take the number of points that Worthy scored last year as a 21-year-old first-round pick, and those guys almost exclusively go on to stardom. So I think people are looking at the risk-reward incorrectly, but it's also something where if you want to say that because Worthy is small and Worthy has occasionally shown an inability to come down with difficult catches. Now, it all depends on what you're looking at, right? When they were playing the preseason game in the rain a couple weeks ago where Worthy wasn't out there, the starters weren't out there, and they're warming up, and he's running down the field. They throw a pass behind him. He rises up with one hand and snags it back over his shoulder like it's nothing and continues to run down the field. I just don't think that we're going to have a huge element there. You read a lot of the Chiefs stuff, and people are like, well, he's not been necessarily the trendy guy in training camp, but he understands the offense now. His route running has significantly improved. And you put that on top of the other elements. I mean, one of the things that is a potential for how this whole thing is building is that the team wanted to get Rice very involved in training camp simply because they're going to then not have him for 6 weeks. Now, we didn't know the exact time period, but you're going to miss him for a big chunk. One of the things with Worthy is that he's probably one of the safer players going into the season for this first month and a half for people who want to get off to fast starts, simply because if Hollywood Brown is mostly banged up and doesn't do much, and if Jalen Royals is also either banged up or unavailable, which at least as we record is up in the air, you're right back to where we were last season, where Xavier Worthy is competing with no one. Now, the other part of this question said that he thinks that the Chiefs will run a conservative offense again this year, especially if Isaiah Pacheco is healthy. I mean, one of the things on that is just sort of a calibration point where the Chiefs didn't run a conservative offense over the second half of last season. And if you look at the wider time frame, they're almost always one of the top passing teams, even though they always lead. And so you're just probably not very well calibrated if you think the Chiefs are going to be a conservative offense. Again, all of these things are possible to happen, and you can always go through and keep track of all the different takes and highlight the ones that turn out to not be the case. But the evidence-based perspective on guys like Xavier Worthy are pretty misunderstood or just being completely elided in the overall conversation, where key information that doesn't fit the narrative that so many people want to go with is simply being left out. And again, that doesn't mean that they won't be right, but you're not going to be right on enough picks over enough years if you leave out the key information and the key context.
And you don't want to just go into, the specific numbers and be like, well, this happened and these are the numbers, so it's good or bad. But you mentioned people leaving out the rushing stuff. It was 104 rushing yards on 20 carries, but he had 3 rushing touchdowns. So you get into then a 9 rushing touchdown season, or a 9 touchdown season in the regular season alone before we get into the postseason stuff, with almost 750 yards on 59 receptions. But a guy who had 98 targets, almost 100 targets. And this is the part I can't get around, is the fact that, like, it seems like Worthy had a bad rookie season. Like, we look at this is bad. When are we moving into this good trajectory, and what's that going to look like? Because that's, I think, the part that people about. And Shawn, I do think one of the things that has knocked Worthy to a large majority of the fantasy community is we've seen a lot of players in the past, like, who have been extremely fast at the combine, then failed to deliver in the NFL. And, like, I think he's getting a little bit like we're going to see him fail as well. But I just think that the way that last season played out, and with the plays that were left on the field, and now that he has a runway here to be the star of this offense, it's very hard just to see a way where it all falls down. And we talked about Tet McMillan earlier in the show, who we obviously really like. Like, Worthy, and you're on about the age that he done it in the NFL. He's 3 weeks younger, or 3 weeks older, sorry, than McMillan is, heading in, and he has a season already done. Is going to be like, if you like young or don't like young, I have to break it to you, Patrick Mahomes is a better quarterback. The situation is set up really well. Anything, Shawn, on Royals before we finish up? Obviously, we're talking about 2 players in Rice and Worthy, who, like, Andy Reid traditionally has taken on these receivers relatively slow until kind of after the bye week. And now you're mentioning kind of the health side of things. Is it, even with Rice out, do you think it's likely to still be a kind of a slow burn until he can be a key part of this offense? Or maybe it's a thing where they have him run certain packages that he can be involved in due to Rice being out?
Yeah, not if he's healthy. I think he was going to be a big part right away. You talk about Rice and why he's actually much more easily replaceable than Xavier Worthy. It's because he does something that requires you to run 2 or 3 yards, turn around, catch the ball, and then run again, which, I mean, they drafted Jalen Royals to be the perfect fill-in for that. Someone who is a clone of Rice in so many ways and is similarly athletic. The problem comes in is that a lot of these teams want to run things that are so complicated, even though basically what they're running is so simple. Now, there are some benefits to that, obviously, is that the level of complication is going to stress the defense. But if your guys can't run it, you don't have enough players, and then you're running out guys like Juju Smith-Schuster, and you have to make excuses about why, this will work and that'll work. You end up with just a much lower ceiling offense. And because the Chiefs have made things difficult on themselves and they have given so many routes to bad players, that was a big part of the overall massive Chiefs piece, is that when you look at the decline of the Chiefs offense over the last several years, it's 2 things. It's the aging of Travis Kelce, and it's the inability to get enough around him to where non-NFL players are running a huge number of routes for the Chiefs, even though in many cases the Chiefs are running almost exclusively 2 wide receiver sets. You think about all of that. If you run an offense out there where you have Worthy and Rice and Royals and Hollywood Brown, and you have very few snaps, very few routes that are being given to non-NFL players, the defense has to account for a lot more, and Patrick Mahomes can go back to being what he is. Unfortunately for the Chiefs, but potentially fortunately for Worthy, all of those other guys are falling by the wayside. I mean, Rice is going to be out for a month and a half. Everything could be different by the time he comes back. But if Royals can't go through the practices leading up to week 1 of his rookie season, then it's almost impossible to see him involved. And the best case scenario would be that, yeah, there would be these packages that he could play in, but even that best case starts to disappear if he's hurt. I, I want to see them at full strength, but it probably benefits Worthy, at least to an extent, that they're simply not going to be.
The question that you referenced, so we will touch on here, is our final one of the show around the Broncos. It kind of fits in. We talked through the Chiefs there. I think it kind of covers a bit. It mentions about fading the Broncos and the Chiefs based on kind of them being a headache and trying to decide who the right piece is. So they mentioned that they tend to ignore the team, those kind of teams altogether, because they never know who to guess right in those situations. When we look at offenses like that, Shawn, I do think that again, you're looking at situations that you have to decipher, but it's also, I think, wrong in those situations to be like, I'm just going to avoid them to try and get those decisions. The other part that it mentions is about the predictability of offenses and predictability of coaches and kind of focusing on those ones that we, expect to be good. Offenses, though, that we also expect to be good would fit into the Broncos and the Chiefs. And also because of the way that they are going to have some of those considerations, particularly the wide receivers for the Broncos, gives you that opportunity at cost because people are going to draft them at a lower ADP and you have to try and make the decision as to which one is. More so, we can get into the Broncos as the example, but how do you feel about fully fading an offense just because it's tricky to decipher which way that the team is going to go? And also, like we see this every year, there's a predictability around how certain teams will do right now, and sometimes the ADP will reflect that. But like in 6 weeks' time, Shawn, when we're at week 5 of the NFL season, we're going to be like, the picture changes week to week, but it changes very much season to season. Predictability of coaches and offenses as you enter a season here.
I think that a lot of this question is right. It kind of cracks me up. It has all the phrasing of a YouTube comment where you get these mixed mystery boxes are 90% of what best ball bros talk about on podcasts. Y'all are wasting 80% of the discussion time debating which one guy in an offense with a coach that will never has the same game plan twice is an exercise in futility, but keep it up because I love how you draw people's attention to the worst picks on the board. It's so funny to have, like, generally speaking, the right take on something, but wrapped in so much arrogance that the drafter themselves um, has lots of problems with how they approach drafts. Colm.
I love the fire Shawn's bringing today on the show. We really have set him off here with the worthy comments at the start.
No, I mean, I think that these are good questions, but the couching of the questions gives you a sense of what the drafters do poorly. And that's fine. And their take is that the podcast gives them a sense of what we do poorly, which is also a viable response. People have their beliefs on the things, and I think that is fine. Hopefully, we'll continue to live in a world, Colm, where people are generally gracious to each other, even when people aren't perfect. But so but embedded in this are like 3 or 4 really interesting points, right? The one thing that's kind of interesting is this idea of commentators. I certainly wouldn't consider myself a best ball bro. I don't know what that means, really. It probably means something, and maybe it does fit. But how much? So one of the things is, like, it seems like there is a push in the direction of talking about the players that, like, everyone agrees on where they should be valued. There's probably not a lot of reason to discuss that unless, you really want to go out there and be like, people are drafting all the wrong players, which I think you can make that argument. We've tried to kind of make that argument on RotoViz since the beginning, but make it in a way that is less dismissive and, contentious than maybe just saying all of these picks are wrong. The obsession in best ball with trying to figure out what miracle type of play is going to win a tournament probably does lead people in the wrong direction. And I think embedded in this question is the idea that you should basically select receivers that you're going to get points from. And that's basically been our approach to best ball all along. And it's been very successful. We think about Jake's research on it that says, you should draft the receivers early. You think about all of the zero RB language from the very beginning, over 10 years now, explaining why you should draft receivers early. You think about all of the MFL 10 of death victories during the time period that people were not drafting properly. It's like, yeah, it's because you draft receivers early. You look at the roster construction explorers from Mike Beers. Again, what does it tell you? That you should draft receivers early. And it goes to this point, which is that you need to have targets and you need to have guys who are going to score. You want your team built around that. And if you don't draft enough and then you're coming out the backside of it and you're saying, okay, no, let's try and figure out these guys where we don't have the information to figure it out, but maybe we can get lucky on hitting on a few of these people. Historically, that hasn't been the way to do it, to generate really elite advance rates, to win individual leagues, all of that type of thing. You're going to get a coin flipping type of element at the end in some tournaments, including the ones that we do well in, where there are going to be some specific scenarios that occur that may help individual teams where those drafters are right, and then it does help you. And so even if you can't get it right ahead of time, but you can simply cover your bets, that's the part that I don't necessarily care for with best ball, where I think that fantasy is the most real when you're saying, these are the guys that we think are going to win. This is the structure that we think is the best to employ in the season. And you mostly do that. And then you can evaluate where you were as opposed to trying to play everything. Now, even when you play everything, you still have a sliding scale of exposures to where you are kind of placing bets on certain ranges of players and mostly fading other ranges of players. In terms of the best ball discussion, there are sweet spots for how you do that depending on what your goals are. As we get back to the Broncos and the Chiefs, I think that fading the Chiefs has not necessarily been a good strategy because Travis Kelce has dominated. Rashee Rice has dominated. Last year, Xavier Worthy got hot down the stretch and was one of the highest scorers in the fantasy playoffs. Individual players may have done well fading the Chiefs, but that wasn't a viable strategy. Approaching it with the Broncos, I think, is probably a little bit different. And you think about Sean Payton back to the New Orleans Saints days. Some of those guys, like a Devery Henderson and the vertical players that they had, there probably would have been best ball viability of some of those players. Certainly, if you're fading a Drew Brees, if you're fading a Michael Thomas, if you're fading a Jimmy Graham, that isn't going to work for you. I do think, though, and this kind of goes back to something that Ben has talked about a decent amount with the Broncos, which is that this group of Mims and Pat Bryant and Troy Franklin, number one, if you claim too strongly that you know what is going to happen, you're basically just hoping to get that right and then being able to say, I told you so, as opposed to admitting that there is a ton of uncertainty. And I think that's what this question gets to and gets to accurately. The other part of it is that there's no guarantee that there'll be any winners because Peyton has, with these peripheral targets, often employed an approach where it's one guy 1 week, one guy the next week, one guy the third week, or even within the course of an individual game, you'll have a guy who seems to be the sort of secondary focal point, but then at the key moment, it's a vertical pass to a Marvin Mims or it's a vertical pass to a Troy Franklin. This offense could give us 0 winners out of those 3 players. But Colm, the opposite point that I would like to make here is that 0 winners is mostly what you get from all of the wide receivers at the end of drafts. And so if you're going to pull out a particular team like the Broncos and say this is unpredictable and these guys aren't going to be winners, it's kind of missing the larger point, which is one of the reasons that you draft receivers early is that is far and away the best way to get points to build out your stacks. One of the articles that Bjorn wrote a few years ago pointed out that historically the back stacking element had been very unsuccessful. Now, again, when you look at specific results, you're going to have people come out and say, well, look at this tournament team that did well, that had a key back stack that if they didn't have that, they wouldn't have won. Or you could go back and you look at 2024 and say 2024 was an outlier season where a lot of this stuff that had mostly been the case from 2015 to 2023. And Colm, I would emphasize that At RotoViz, we've been looking at this stuff for a decade, not simply analyzing Best Ball Mania for a couple of years. And so we've got a pretty wide viewpoint on what will work in best ball and in different best ball formats. And so if someone wants to say, well, in 2024, what you're talking about is wrong, that again is fine. We're going to get all kinds of crazy outcomes. I think that 2025 is going to be so fun simply because I expect more crazy outcomes. But I do think that you want to start from a perspective of understanding what's happened historically and understanding what things are more usual occurrences and what things were individual season based flukes. And flukes from the perspective of they weren't likely to happen, they did happen, they certainly could happen again. Right. So we want to approach this from a humility based perspective. And in terms of the language on things and how you couch, questions and comments and how we couch things for podcasts, everybody is a little bit different, right? And what sounds like humility to one person is going to sound like arrogance to the next person, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I guess basically, I think this is a fantastic question. I do think there is so much interesting in it. I think it gets a lot of things wrong, but I also think it gets a lot of. I, I think it's important to consider and to understand what it also gets right. And so, anyway, we appreciate all of these comments, even the snarky ones.
Even the snarky ones, but awesome. What I love about, I always say this about listener suggested topics or questions or comments. They provide a topic that we probably wouldn't touch on the show unless we got them. It's not like I'm going to message Shawn earlier today and be like, let's talk about this. But then when we get the questions, it prompts that idea. We get all sorts of great discussion points. So awesome stuff. Thanks for everyone who has been commenting on the YouTube videos or sharing questions through social media or via email. You can always do that at rotovizradio@gmail.com or to me on socials at Overtime Ireland. Shawn, we're going to wrap it up there. This is a pretty long for a non-draft edition of RotoViz OT. We've hit the 50-minute mark, so hopefully people have enjoyed listening, and we will have more content to come before the start of the NFL season. We'll be squeezing in those final drafts. Good luck to everyone in their drafts if you're drafting this weekend or over the course of the next week. We hope you bring home those championships in 2025. If you are signing up over at rotoviz.com, you can use the promo code RVRadio2025 at checkout to get yourself a 10% discount. Shawn mentioned at the start all the fantastic pieces and work that is up on the site at the minute. I would highly recommend heading over and checking all that out. And until we are back, have a good one.